Good afternoon. My name is Stephen Zacharias, and I'm a museum educator here at the Campbell County Rockpile Museum, located in Gillette, Wyoming. I want to say thank you to all of you for joining with us here today. It has been a challenging year or so here in Northeast Wyoming and across the globe. It's been a long time since we've been able to gather all together in one place, to come together to tell and share stories. It's also been a long time since we've just gathered together with friends and families, particularly. I want to give a shout out personally to all my nieces and nephews back in the Pacific Northwest, many whom I haven't seen since Thanksgiving of 2019. Especially nephew number 2, he turned 6 today on this very day. So happy birthday, nephew number 2. He's watching from Central Oregon right now. Welcome all to this very special edition of Black and Yellow Theater, Voices of the Powder River Basin from the Black Hills to Yellowstone. Our Black and Yellow Theater programming is designed to give our guests live, interactive experiences that will immerse and engage you in the diverse natural and cultural resources, history, and landscape of the Powder River Basin, which for centuries has been traversed by humans and animals during seasonal migrations necessary to survive and thrive on the Great Plains. While the landscape of the Powder River Basin was influenced by these migrations for millennia by members of the Apsaluk, Nitsipi, Sutai and Sisistas, Oceti-Secoan, Numakiki, Haraka, Sanish, and even the Hinana-Hine, it wasn't until just over a century ago that humans finally decided to call the Powder River Basin home year-round. And on May 20th, 1862, President Abraham Lincoln signed the United States Homestead Act, initiating a series of laws that would allow individuals to acquire land for ownership. The homestead shack you see behind me was built by Campbell County homesteader U.S. Staley Archibald after he filed his homestead claim in the fall of 1921. Mr. Archibald was originally from Illinois, where in 1913 he became an Eagle Scout, and by 1917 had early enlisted to serve in the United States Medical Reserve Corps. He would then join the Volunteer Ambulance Unit, and they were attached to British Expeditionary Forces in France. It was during his service in the Great War that Mr. Archibald found out about a lifelong family dream finally coming to fruition. In May of 1918, the Casper, Wyoming Star-Tribune newspaper published one of his letters home to his parents. That letter contained the following passage. "Say, it listens good to me to hear that you're preparing to go to Casper. At least it makes me hopeful of certain things when I get back to the States. Dad promised me when I was a kid that we would go west when I got older." Staley Archibald, the first Eagle Scout to ever live in Wyoming, built this structure along Bates Creek in southern Campbell County in the wintertime of 1921 and 22. His claim for 320 acres would be granted to him on October 6, 1926. Mr. Archibald, along with his wife, Miss Pearl, and their sons, Charles and William, would transform that original claim into the 7,000 plus acre Pine Tree Ranch. That ranch specialized in breeding, raising, and showing the newly developed Columbia sheep. Today's program, The Roots Beneath Your Feet, the Homestead Act of 1862, is a joint program being offered in partnership today with Homestead National Historical Park, a unit of the National Park Service located in Beatrice, Nebraska. Throughout the program today, please leave any questions you might have in the comment section, and we'll do our best to answer as many of them as we can during the Q&A portion towards the end of our time together today. We are pleased to be joined by historian Jonathan Fairchild At Homestead National Historic Park, he is responsible for overseeing the National Historic Preservation Act compliance, assisting scholars and visitors with research and records requests. He maintains the park's research library, conducts original research and records requests, maintains the park's research library, and helps to further the field of homesteading history, and the park staff interpret the Homestead Act of 1862 and the impact it had on United States history. Again, thank you all so much for joining with us today for the Roots Beneath Your Feet, the Homestead Act of 1862. It is now my honor to turn this program over to historian Jonathan Fairchild.
Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Jonathan Fairchild. I'm the historian here at Homestead National Historical Park. We're a unit of the National Park Service dedicated to telling the story of the Homestead Act of 1862 and the millions of lives that law impacted across the country. And today's program will be talking about the Homestead Act, those who settled under it, and doing a deep dive into the homesteading history of Campbell County, Wyoming, whose rich history of homesteading peaked about 100 years ago. Finally, I'll end the program by talking about the genealogical records that are available to you in order to learn about your own history and the roots beneath your feet, so that you can learn about your family's role in the epic tale of homesteading history. So I'm actually going to pop off screen here so I'm not blocking the PowerPoint. The Homestead Act was signed into law on May 20th, 1862 by President Lincoln in order to promote westward settlement across the United States. And it was a revolutionarily democratic piece of legislation which allowed any adult citizen the ability to become a landowner for free. Men, women, immigrants, African Americans, Latinos, and Latinas, the Homestead Act was an accommodating piece of legislation that extended an invitation to the world. To claim land under the Homestead Act, there were a few requirements. You had to be 21 years or the head of a household. You had to live on the land for 5 years. You had to make improvements, which meant cultivating crops or raising livestock, depending on the type of homestead you claimed. You had to be an American citizen or state your intent to become one. And finally, since it was passed during the Civil War, you could not have served in the Confederate Army, although that requirement was later lifted during Reconstruction. The very first claim made under the Homestead Act was Daniel Freeman's. You can see a picture of him there, when he met a land office agent at a New Year's Eve party, and he signed his paperwork just after midnight on January 1st, 1863, which was as soon as the law went into effect. Homestead National Historical Park is actually located right on the site of his 160-acre homestead claim here in Gage County, Nebraska, the first homestead. But we do tell the whole grand story here, all 30 homesteading states. If you see on this map, those states in the brown, from Florida all the way in the southeast, all the way up to Alaska. So each of these states, you are able to claim land under the Homestead Act, anything in the public domain. So we talk about the 270 million acres of land claimed across the country by millions of homesteaders, and of course their 93 million living descendants today. That homesteading story lasted more than 120 years between the first homesteader, Daniel Freeman here in Nebraska, and the very last homesteader, pictured there, Ken Deerdorf, who received his patent up in Alaska in 1988. Though the Homestead Act was passed in 1862 and took effect the following year, it didn't really reach Wyoming until a little later than that. Territories and states on the West Coast filled out sooner, between the Oregon Trail and the gold and silver rushes in California and Nevada. Those three territories attained statehood in 1859, 1850, and 1864, respectively. In fact, the Great Plains were once referred to as the Great American Desert. There is a sense that with a relative lack of timber and water, that it was land poorly suited to agriculture. However, with the coming of the Transcontinental Railroad, Wyoming was much more easily connected to markets elsewhere in the country. And when the Union Pacific Railroad drove their stretch of the Transcontinental Railroad through southern Wyoming from 1867 through 1869 before linking up at Promontory Point in Utah to drive the so-called Golden Spike. That's when the territory of Wyoming was actually created. It was after the Union Pacific arrived. Often the success of homesteading communities was closely linked to the arrival of the railroad. Railroads provided transportation, access to markets for homesteaders' goods and crops, and spurred in further immigration and development for the surrounding area. So the first homestead claims in Wyoming start coming right after the driving of the Golden Spike. And statewide, the first homestead patent was issued in 1875. In Campbell County, the first homesteaders received their land in 1885. Luca B. Hunter, Max D. Staples, Albert J. Roll, Lee Lawton, and Otto Raymond all proved up their homesteads on January 15th, 1885 in Township 55 North, 71 West, or 56 North, 71 West. But after that first group, nobody else proved up for nearly 5 years, and the total number of homesteaders that early on was very low. There were only 16 total before 1900. In fact, Campbell County wasn't even created until 1911 out of land in Crook and Weston counties. Pictured on this slide, we can see Gillette Avenue around 1892. You can see people on horseback and seated in wagons and standing in the street posing for a photo in front of the Windsor building. This is the earliest known photograph of Gillette. Here we see the interior of John T. Daly's general merchandise store. Daly is the man visible there on the left of the picture. So this store dates to the earliest history of Gillette. It was established as the Daly Brothers store in 1891 as the first mercantile establishment of Gillette and was open for 48 years until his passing in 1939. Though homesteaders were as self-sufficient as they could be, having something like general store was crucial to acquire all the things that a homesteader couldn't grow, raise, or build on their own. And Daly's store served that need for nearly the entire period of homesteading in Campbell County. Daly was actually also a successful homesteader, rancher, and landowner himself. He acquired an 80-acre homestead in 1911, and over the years grew his holdings through purchases of public domain lands, as well as proving up 640 acres of land under the Enlarged Homestead Act and the Stock Raising Homestead Act in 1922. In total, he homesteaded or purchased over 1,000 acres of public domain land directly from the federal government. And in 1923, the county purchased his residence in Gillette for just over $16,000 to convert it to the county courthouse. But while a town and a market nearby was important for the success of a homestead, most homesteaders, of course, lived some distance from town. Here we can see an image of the Rockwell, or the Thornburg homestead, which was about 15 miles southeast of Wright, one of the earliest and at the time of this photograph, best surviving dugout homesteads in Wyoming. Jack Thornburg lived in this dugout on his 640-acre stock raising homestead claim, which he successfully proved up in 1923. There's not much timber available, so settlers often built these dugouts as well as sod houses, usually intended as temporary dwellings, while they established their homestead in a more permanent way. To build a 12-foot by 14-foot sod house, it took roughly an acre of sod. And dugouts were usually sited on the sides of hills or in ravines near water, usually 5 to 6 feet high, with holes, a dugout measuring 10 by 14 to 12 by 18 feet. And dugouts offered more protection in storms than other houses and were easier to heat in the winter and easier to cool in the summer, most of all, though, they were cheap. But they were considered suited best for bachelors, and homesteaders strived to improve as soon as possible. They were mostly used as a primary dwelling for a few years, although often repurposed for other uses. This black and white image from a photo postcard depicts haying with a 4-horse team on the Heald Ranch. Homesteading was often a family affair. The more family members claimed land in their own name, the larger a family ranch could grow. Between 1922 and 1930, the family was issued 8 patents in Campbell County. Archibald appears to have relocated first. The rest of the family appeared together on the 1920 census in western Nebraska. He proved up a 640-acre homestead claim in Campbell County in 1922, and as he was proving up that claim, the rest of his family came out to stake their own claims. His mother, Mary, received her patent in 1926 at the age of 59, as did 2 of Archie's brothers and 1 sister. George, Willis, and Marion all received homesteads in their own name. And altogether, the family claimed more than 3,000 acres of public domain homestead lands for free in less than 10 years. So let's take a look at the impacts that the Homestead Act had over the entire county over the years. So we see here a chart of the homesteads proved up in Campbell County, Wyoming from 1900 to 1930. So technically there are homestead patents that were issued as early as the 1880s and all the way into the 1940s, but I wanted to focus here on the most active period. So between 1900 and 1909, it starts to slowly pick up a little towards the end of the decade. And then from 1910 to 1919, there were 862. So now we're starting to get somewhere with an average of about 90 per year. But you can see there on the graph where it really takes off. In the late 1910s, and especially the early 1920s, far and away the peak of Campbell County homesteading. You see the spike there. 1919, you have 223. 1920 jumps up to 520, reaches its absolute peak in 1921 at 725. And then 489 in 22, and 306 in 23. And by 1924, the peak is essentially over. From 1924 through the rest of the decade, there were only 440 total. But in that 5-year period from 1919 to 1923, we see 2,263 homesteads that were successfully proved up. So that's roughly triple that of the previous decade. And then after this chart ends, from 1930 to 1939, there are only 78, with only 2 issued in the 1940s and none beyond. So the last 2 homestead patents issued in Campbell County were William R. Wright in 1941 and Benjamin Schultz in 1943. The Homestead Act of 1862 was just one of several homestead laws over the years. Others include the Timber Culture Act of 1873, which allowed individuals to claim up to 160 acres of land in exchange for planting 40 acres of trees. There was the Enlarged Homestead Act of 1909, which granted 320 acres of land in areas without access to water. And there was yet another homestead law, which, especially in Campbell County, was even more widely used than the original 1862 law, the Stock Raising Homestead Act of 1916. Conditions in much of the agricultural land east of the Mississippi River meant that 160 acres was enough to support a family farm there. But with dryland farming in the western part of the country, often the marginal quality of lands meant that larger tracts were required. So this version of the Homestead Act provided up to 640 acres of land, or one section, from public lands that were designated as being, quote, chiefly valuable for grazing and raising forage crops, do not contain merchantable timber, are not susceptible of irrigation from any known source of water, and are of such character that 640 acres are reasonably required for the support of a family. The requirements were mostly identical to the original Homestead Act. It still had a residency requirement. It required improvements, just that instead of growing crops, you had to raise livestock and construct relevant improvements to ranching. And those who had claimed land previously under earlier homestead laws, such as the Homestead Act of 1862 or the Enlarged Homestead Act of 1909, were allowed to make additional claims up to this new maximum of 640 acres, so long as they met the requirements of the new law. So you'll often see people with multiple homestead claims, perhaps one of 160 acres under the original law and 480 acres under this new law, or 320 and 320, in order to reach that 640 acre level. Another major distinction with this law, you did not possess subsurface rights, so coal, mineral, oil, and gas rights were reserved by the United States, allowing others to locate and remove these deposits and occupying as much of the surface as required to do so after acquiring consent or a waiver from the homesteader or owner of the land patent. So here we see a chart of the land claimed specifically under the Stock Raising Homestead Act in Campbell County, Wyoming. The chart starts in 1919, as that was the earliest year that someone could have successfully proved up their claim and met the requirements to receive their patent or the deed to the land from the General Land Office. There are only 7 claims in that first year, but there are only 300 issued nationwide, so it's actually a fairly high number for a single county. And we can see that it immediately takes off during roughly the same peak that the original Homestead Act had in Campbell County, with the bulk there between about 1920 and 1926, and the highest years being 1921, 1922, 1923. You see there 518, 581, and 489. So between 1919 and 1923, there were 1,777 patents issued. From 24 to 26, 862. And then from 1927 until 1944, which was the last year that a homestead patent was issued, there were a further 1,057 for a total of 3,700 patents issued, which exceeds the number of 160-acre patents in number and well exceeds it in terms of land given away. Lee B. Fisher received his patent on June 24th, 1919. He was the first person in Wyoming and in Campbell County to receive land under this law, and one of the first 15 across the entire country. Sadly, he passed away less than a year later of pneumonia brought on after a case of scarlet fever. The very last one of these patents in the county was issued to Mabel Kennard Chase for 640 acres on the county line between Campbell and Johnson in 1943. So as I was researching some of the land history under the Homestead Act in the county, I noticed that a very high number of women were homesteaders and receiving patents to the land. So I'd like to talk about that a little bit. Wyoming earned the nickname the Equality State for being the first territory or state across the country to grant women's suffrage, or the right to vote, when Governor Campbell signed a suffrage bill into law in December 1869. When the territorial legislature met in Cheyenne that year, it proposed a group of progressive laws, among these guaranteeing that female teachers would be paid the same as men, and that women had property rights separate from their husbands, no small thing in a state with 18 million acres of homestead land, or 30% of the entire state, claimed under the Homestead Acts. One factor in driving these early victories for women's rights in the Wyoming Territory was the scarcity of women. There was only one woman in Wyoming over the age of 21 for every 6 men. And after the passage of women's suffrage, the editor of the Cheyenne Leader, a newspaper there, wrote, "We now expect at once quite an immigration of ladies to Wyoming. We say to them, come on." And come on they did, many under the Homestead Acts. The first woman to successfully prove up a homestead claim in the state was Ellen Hatch, who received her land in 1877, just the 8th homesteader across the entire state. When Wyoming was up for statehood in 1889, Congress actually threatened to deny statehood unless Wyoming renounced women's suffrage, and the territorial legislature responded, "We will remain out of the Union 100 years rather than come in without the women." And it worked. Though the vote was close, Wyoming became the first state in the Union with women's suffrage. So pictured here, we see the Rosette store, the Shaughnessy Mercantile Company, owned by Kate Shaughnessy. And she received 3 different homestead patents over the year. The first in 1908 as a widow of her husband, John. But then she actually proved up 2 more stock-raising homesteads on her own in 1926 and 1937 to come to that maximum of 640 acres. So we've talked about the peak of the homesteading era in Campbell County, which was between about 1919 and 1924. And there was this tremendous burst of activity, thousands of claims successfully proved up in just a few short years. But what caused this peak, and why did it only last a few years? So there are several factors which combined for the rise in claims. There were a series of laws amending or changing the Homestead Acts to make it easier to claim and to prove up land, and also to receive larger and larger quantities of land, creating the shift towards dryland farming and ranching. So the 1909 Enlarged Homestead Act allowed claims going from 160 now to 320 acres, or doubling it. And in 1912, the residency requirement of homesteading was reduced from 5 years to 3 years. We've already discussed the impact of the Stock Raising Homestead Act of 1916. So when that let anyone claim 640 acres of grazing land for free, that was just a tremendous opportunity. The earliest that anyone could claim their lands under that law was 1919. So that's when we start to see that stock raising boom in the county. And the end result of these changes is that there were more homesteaders nationwide between 1900 and 1925 than ever before or after, which I think is fascinating. A lot of people, I think, when they think of homesteading, think things like the Oregon Trail or Little House on the Prairie, covered wagons. But really, we're talking about the age of the Model T and transcontinental rail transport, right? Another factor in the boom was international in nature. So as World War I was raging in Europe between 1914 and 1918, war-torn Western Europe was unable to grow enough food. So farmers and ranchers in America were encouraged to drastically step up production. For example, from 1908 to 1914, Great Britain imported around 5,000 tons of meat from the US every year. Between 1915 and 1917, that number jumps to 10 times as much, and 130,000 tons in 1918 as German submarine warfare took its toll on Atlantic shipping. Other agricultural production and prices similarly experienced a boom during the war years. For example, wheat jumped about 300%. But as we all know, what goes up must come down. A variety of factors led to the fall of the homesteading boom, both in Campbell County and across the country. After 5 years of prices and production levels of crops and livestock continuously rising, the Treaty of Versailles, officially ending World War I, was signed in June of 1919. Europe's high demand for American goods fell off as post-war reconstruction took hold and allowed Europe to begin economic recovery. The high level of American production meant that farmers were acquiring more and more land and more equipment, which farmers often did by extending on credit or taking out mortgages and loans. So when the demand fell, it left many in a precarious position. Dryland farming on much of the Great Plains was feasible when economic conditions were strong, demand was high, and rains were heavy. But in the 1920s and 1930s, much of the Great Plains went through an extended drought and the infamous Dust Bowl. This 1-2 punch left many teetering on the edge right as the U.S. was entering the Great Depression. The famous stock market crash of Black Tuesday happened in October of 1929. And the Great Depression was at its worst in the early 1930s. One last major factor leading to the end of the homesteading boom was the passage of the Taylor Grazing Act of 1934. Though the Dust Bowl affected Wyoming much less severely than elsewhere in the Great Plains, President Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration sought a series of laws to address both the Depression and the Dust Bowl on a national scope. So the Taylor Grazing Act saw that over decades of farming and ranching, the soil had deteriorated significantly, allowing the Dust Bowl to rage out of control. This law placed grazing districts under the management of the Department of the Interior in an effort to stabilize the land, and had the side effect of severely limiting the lands available to be homesteaded. So though homesteading was still legal until 1976 in the lower 48 states, and 1986 in Alaska, the 1930s saw the end of that homesteading boom. The very first homestead in Campbell County, Wyoming was issued in 1885, the very last in 1944. Though the Homestead Act ended when it was repealed in 1976, its impact can still be seen clearly across the country. The distinct pattern under the public land survey system of quarter, half, and full sections of land are visible from the air. Homesteads, windmills, barns, and other outbuildings remain. Trees planted as windbreaks and under the Timber Culture Act remain standing, even in places where the homestead is gone. But the most important impact is the lives it changed, those who pursued the American dream and became landowners. The Homestead Act changed millions of lives from people all across the globe from all walks of life. Another way to see the impact is to look at the descendants of those who homesteaded. Even today, there are fourth, fifth, sixth generation and beyond still living and working on the family farm or ranch. Countless more children and grandchildren, though maybe have left the homestead, were able to get an education and a career thanks to the stability and prosperity their families achieved, many of whom became landowners for the first time under the Homestead Act. I think it's just such a powerful story, which has touched millions and millions of lives here in this country. So I'd actually like to wrap up today by talking a little bit more about some of the resources available out there for anyone who might be descended from a homesteader to learn more about that part of your family history. Over the course of the Homestead Act's 123-year history, over 2 million individual homestead claims were made. Every one of these claims generated a written record known as a land entry case file that was kept by the U.S. General Land Office. Today, these are stored in the National Archives, and the complete collection of case files created under the Homestead Act is over 30 million pages of documents. Since 1999, Homestead National Historical Park has been involved in a project that aims to digitize all 30 million documents of the Homestead Case Files collection. To date, the records for 10 states have been digitized and made available online. So if you look at the map here, any of those states in green have been fully digitized and made available online. These states in white are homesteading states. So any of those 30 states, we can pull at least the General Land Office records for. The states in green, we can pull the case files for, and all of them are available in the National Archives. So these case files are treasure troves of historical and genealogical information. They indicate the applicant, whether the patent was issued or not, a description of the property, the type of the transaction, the cost of the land. They'll contain things like a homesteader's date and place of birth, spouses or children that lived on the homestead, naturalization information for immigrants, notations about military service, even things like the types of crops planted, the value and types of homes and other buildings constructed, and more. So I'd like to take a quick look at the General Land Office records and the land entry case files in order to show you what that looks like and how to start researching on your own. So let me pull up a web browser here. So this is the Bureau of Land Management's General Land Office records, and I'll actually start on the home page here. So to find your family, I would recommend first going to this button right here, Search Documents. You can search a couple of different things: patents, surveys, land status records, control document index, and tract books. I would recommend just starting with patents. So once again, that's the deed to the land. You can search in a few different ways. You can search by state and county, by name. If you know the legal land description, you can use this. And down here, the only one I'd really recommend using is the date and the authority. This is the type of law. So for us, we'd be looking for homesteads. So first we'll change it to Wyoming here. Specify Campbell County. Go down to authority. So we can search specifically for homesteads or for stock raising homesteads. So this one right here, Homestead Entry Original, we see the date 1862. It's the 1862 Homestead Act. You can also search the stock raising. But I'll go ahead and do a homestead entry original and hit search. So we see here up at the top, your list may be incomplete due to a limit of 2,000 results. It shows up to 100 pages of 20 people at once. So I'll just go ahead and search. So here we see George Pearson, authority May 20, 1862, homestead entry original. Issue date August 17th, 1907, 160 acres. Now, this has a map tool, so we can actually see exactly where this homestead is if we're not familiar with that. This was all done on the Public Land Survey System, PLSS. So this large orange square, that is the township. So it's Township 48 North, 69 West. Within that, we have the sections. There are 36 sections in a township. It's 6 miles by 6 miles square. We're looking at section 27, and within that section, we see this dark orange. So that would be where this quarter section is, 160 acres. With this tool, we can also pull up the patent image. So that's the image of the deed to this land. Just a second to load here. Looks like it might be down right now. So I'll go ahead and show you the, oh, did it load there? Yeah. All right, so this is a copy of the patent or the deed to the land that was issued. So we see the homestead certificate number, 1037, application number 1413. Zoom in a little bit. So issued from the land office in Sundance to George Pearson. There's the legal land description showing exactly where it's at. Authorized by President Theodore Roosevelt. We can also see the related documents. So these are individuals that claimed land adjacent to this homestead. And this is often a good place to look for people that may have been related or even married into the family later. So I'd often recommend searching this tab if you're trying to do a cluster research and figure out more family members to search for. Now, once we found out that someone is indeed a homesteader, there's another tool we can use, the land entry case files. So those are available on Ancestry.com. So we'll pull up Ancestry here. To find that, we want to use a certain type of record. We want specifically homestead records. So we'll type in the card catalog keyword homestead, hit search. It'll be the third one down on the list here. So I believe that individual last name was Pearson. We'll type in a last name. And then where it says any event, location, we'll type in the county. So we're looking for Campbell County, Wyoming, and search. I believe it was this one in Sundance. So these are usually about 15 to 20 pages of documentation. As an individual is meeting all the requirements of the Homestead Act, they'd have to go to the land office to show that they were doing that. And there'd be paperwork filed as they were doing that. So you have the application, the affidavit, there will be receipts. This is declaration of intention. So George Pearson, we see here, was an immigrant. And he's declared his intention to become a citizen and renounce his citizenship to Queen Victoria, so Great Britain, I suppose. Another homestead affidavit. Non-mineral, so he doesn't have the mineral rights to his homestead. So here we have a receipt. Homesteading, the land itself was free. You didn't pay for the land, but when you went to the land office, you did have to pay to file the paperwork. We see here, this one was $16. Usually the process was around $18 to $20, which even back then for 160 to 640 acres of land was dirt cheap. Certificate as to posting of notice. So once you got close to finishing your homestead, you had to declare in a local newspaper that you were about to prove up your homestead claim so that neighbors and other witnesses could potentially come out and testify, wait a second, he hasn't met his requirements. He's not ready to claim his homestead yet. It was meant to reduce potential fraud. So we see his witnesses here. You would go to the land office and testify on your behalf and have witnesses testify on your behalf that you were ready to receive your land. There's the publication again. So this one's actually got quite a few different types of documentation. Let's see if he's got his testimony. Usually I think the most compelling is the testimony. Here we go. So the testimony of the witness and also the testimony of the homesteader has quite a bit of genealogical information that may not even be available anywhere else. We see here Elizabeth Badgett, 36 years old, called as a witness in support of Mr. Pearson's homestead here. States that it was for grazing and agricultural land. States exactly when he arrived on the land, August 1901. He's unmarried. Has 3 or 4 acres for grazing purposes and 6 crops of oats and grain. A log house and fencing, about $300. There's his witness testimony and his own testimony here. George Pearson on his own behalf, 60 years old, Moorcraft, Wyoming. And so these are available for all of those states we saw on that map in green. But if you have ancestors from one of these states that weren't digitized yet, they do still exist. They're just in the National Archives. And if that's something that you're interested in acquiring, you're welcome to email us here at the park or call us, and I'd be happy to explain that process as well. So there's that map again. All right, well, if you have any questions about the Homestead Act or homesteading anywhere across the country, about any of those records that I just shared, I'd be happy to field any of those questions now. And thank you very much for letting me come in and present for y'all today.
Well, Jonathan, I just really want to say thank you again for agreeing to venture on this virtual experience. It was a great time. I've even learned some new tips and tricks and a lot of information that I had been researching, but I learned quite a bit today. So I really appreciate you agreeing to do this. Thank you. We do have some questions for you. I've been doing living history and cultural interpretation for probably about 19, 20 years now. And most of my experience has been in the Pacific Northwest, Alaska, and even in the Southeast. And so a lot of people associate homesteading with that Abraham Lincoln log cabin, and then also that it was only allowed for white men um, to homestead and gather land. What are some ways um, to talk about the misconceptions, I guess, associated with the Homestead Act of 1862 when it comes to who homesteaders were and how they established their homesteads?
Sure, yeah, that's a great question. So like I talked about in the beginning of the presentation, homesteading goes on for a long, long time, right? So it starts in the 1860s, but it goes all the way to the 1980s. And the peak, even outside of Campbell County, the peak nationwide isn't until well after 1900. So it's not just Abraham Lincoln and a log cabin, right? And certainly that's a big part of the story, but it's 30 different states, all different time periods. I've seen research about homesteads in Florida in the 1950s that are right around where NASA is today. And, they end up getting bought out to create the Space Center. And that's certainly not a sentence you'd expect to hear in relation to homesteading. Going to the moon and homesteading. There are homesteads in Campbell County, peak of 1920, homesteaders driving around in their Model Ts, right? But in terms of the diversity, I think it's important to remember that it's certainly not just white men, and even at the very beginning of the Homestead Act, here in Gage County, like I said, Daniel Freeman was the first homesteader anywhere in the country, but just a few short weeks after he filed his claim was the first woman homesteader anywhere in the country, filing her claim in the early 1860s as well. And throughout the entire period of the Homestead Act, more than 10% of the claimants were women, and in certain parts of the country, that number is even higher than that. In places like Wyoming and Montana, it's more like 15, 20%. In Campbell County, I've seen years where it's more like 25%. So women are very active participants in the Homestead Act as well. And there are a fairly substantial number of African Americans homesteading. There are a substantial number of Latin Americans homesteading. Especially in the Southwest, you see a lot of Latin Americans homesteading out in Arizona and New Mexico, California. You see a lot of African Americans homesteading in Oklahoma and throughout the Great Plains. We actually just finished a historic research study in partnership with the Center for Great Plains to learn about some of, they're called the homesteader colonies, basically settlements of African-American homesteaders in Nebraska, in Kansas, in Colorado, in New Mexico, in South Dakota, in Wyoming, as well in Empire, Wyoming. And I think that that's a fascinating part of the story that a lot of people don't really know about. So definitely exciting to be part of that research and learning more about that.
Right. And I would ask, do you have your own theory on why, especially with the African-American experience, like there has been a lot on exodusters, but then it doesn't really happen. It doesn't go into what happens to the next generation or and beyond. And that story kind of gets lost. And I'm still trying to wade my way through it because Empire's not too far from us. It's on the southern tip of the Powder River Basin, or was on the southern tip of the Powder River Basin. So, what's your theory on why, beyond that first generation of exodusters, we don't really know their story?
So I would say that you probably hit the nail on the head there when you said was, right? I think part of it is that, like a lot of homesteader communities in the 20s and 30s, with some of those factors I was talking about, like with drought, with the Dust Bowl, with the Great Depression, white, black, it didn't matter. A lot of these communities struggled to make it through those conditions. And with Today, the only one of the major Black homesteader communities that's still around is Nicodemus, Kansas. And so I think part of it is just that they're not physically present anymore. But I don't think that that diminishes what they meant at the time. I don't think it diminishes their legacy. And of course, it's amazing that 5, 6, 7 generations on, there are still families on their original homestead. But I think for a lot of these, especially with African American homesteaders, but for anyone, for immigrant homesteaders, a lot of these families, like I said, were owning land for the first time. They were getting out of crowded cities, trying to make something for themselves, and they weren't all necessarily looking to be on the land permanently. They were just, some of them, looking for a transition to be able to launch themselves on to the next thing. And I think that that can be a way to measure the success of a homestead or the Homestead Act for those people as well.
Yeah, great. On your site, I know everybody's kind of in phases of reopening, but let's say everything goes well, all the adults in America get their vaccines, or enough of them get their vaccines by summer. What are some of the things that visitors who visit Homestead National Historic Park can see, do, and perhaps the resources that you have available on site beyond what's available online?
Sure. So I do want to say we are actually open. Of course, social distancing and masks highly encouraged, but we are open. So here at the park, we have a couple of different buildings. We have the Heritage Center, which is a museum dedicated to the Homestead Act and the homesteaders. And at the Heritage Center, we have a genealogical research center. We have computers set up to help people learn about their homesteading backgrounds and their family histories. We provide research and reference assistance at no cost, so whether that's virtually or in person. We have a homesteader cabin from the 1870s that's open to the public. You're welcome to come in and visit that. We have the Education Center, which has a few more exhibits on farm implements and agricultural machinery from throughout the Homestead era. And we have the Freeman School, which was a one-room schoolhouse used by the community here from the 1870s to the 1960s.
Excellent. I just want to let everybody, we've had a couple of people mention in the comments about where they can get more info or where they can access that info. On our YouTube page, in the description, we will have links to Homestead National Historic Park, the Rockpile Museum, as well as the Bureau of Land Management office records. So you can just click those links straight from the description, and we'll post that later this afternoon. Well, it looks like we're about coming to the end of our time here. Again, Jonathan, I want to thank you so much for agreeing to do this today. And do you have anything else you want to leave our guests with this afternoon?
No, I don't think so. Y'all have a wonderful day.
Excellent. Well, we really appreciate it. And I just want to let everybody know we will still be providing these virtual experiences. Our next one will be announced later this afternoon on our Facebook page for the Rockpile Museum. And that event will be scheduled on Monday, February 8th. So stay tuned this afternoon. It will be an exciting virtual program. And this time we're going to deal with history, but we're going to deal through music and American history that way. So stay tuned this afternoon for that. We do, once again, thank you all for joining with us today for this unique virtual edition of Black and Yellow Theater, Voices of the Powder River Basin from the Black Hills to Yellowstone. Jonathan, thank you. Hope the weather gets a little bit better there in Beatrice. I know you guys had some snowstorms. We're having wind right now, so the building feels like it's about to blow down on me, but the sun is shining here, so hopefully that will catch up to you tomorrow. So.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.